Hey, how's it going everyone? So for today's video, I'm just going to show you how to service a basic front disc brake system. So the vehicle we're using is a 2006 Subaru Legacy GT. We have the 17-inch wheel option, and that'll be specific for our specs when we start looking up our brake service information. So this vehicle does have a little bit of a squeak, and we got a pretty good lip coming up on the rotor. So we're going to measure the rotor thickness as well as the pad thickness and determine whether or not it be serviced, and then replace if need be. So a couple of tools that we're going to use to service the brakes is we got basic hand tools just to loosen up the caliper and the caliper hanger, some brake lubricant for our piston pin sliders, a wire brush. These are kind of overlooked. This is to clean off the rust off the hub, a brake caliper hanger tool, which I have a video on how to make one of these yourself at home out of old U-bolts. Different brake gauges. So these are pad thickness gauges. These are really nice because these are pretty much go no-go gauges. They're feeler gauges that you go up to the pad and you measure how much pad thickness you have compared to the backing plate, and that'll determine whether or not you replace them. So you got red as needs to be replaced, yellow is you're getting close, and green is still within spec. A micrometer specific for brake rotors, so it can go around the lip. So this is a larger one that's a bit different than a normal micrometer. And then we have the caliper piston compressors. Now you can use a C-clamp or a really large set of channel locks, but if you can get a hold of a actual legit compressor like this, these will make your life a whole lot easier. These are really nice to have. All right, so at this point I've already removed the caliper bolts from the sliding caliper to the actual bracket itself. If it's a fixed caliper, it'll just have two mounting bolts to the steering knuckle. In the case of this, we do have our caliper mounted to a fixed bracket. So we're going to use our supporting hanger to support the caliper up to prevent the brake line from sagging. On this particular vehicle, I did remove the brake line anchor to give us a little bit more room. From here, we have access to both the front and or the inside and outside pad. What we're going to do is we're going to find whichever one of these gauges lines up with the thinnest section. So that one's fitting right about right, and that's going to be putting us at 3 millimeter. So these pads are definitely discardable. With the pads removed, we can now gain access to measuring the rotor thickness. Now in this particular vehicle, service specification specs the minimum rotor thickness, or the discard rotor thickness, at 1 inch and 23 thousandths. So if we use our micrometer, we'll go around the lip right here, and we'll try to get towards the center of the rotor, and we'll measure that up. And I'm gonna have to read this on the car. So we're 1 inch, we're just about 1 95 thousandths of an inch. The maximum thickness on these, or what they are new, is 1.125 inches. So we have room to where we can machine. However, these are slotted rotors, and not all brake lathes can cut these. You do have the ability to get around these slots and to cut these, but it's not ideal. It's one of those things that it's probably better to discard these just because you wreck your cutting tips trying to do this. So on these particular rotors, these would be discardable regardless. But if we had the ability to cut these without, if these weren't slotted, then we could machine these rotors and just replace the pads. All right, so that we've determined that we need to replace our brakes, we're gonna go ahead and replace the brakes with new rotors and new calipers. Most brake kits will also come with the caliper hanger sliders. These will allow the pads to slide evenly and equally on the caliper hanger. We also want to make sure anytime we have a vented rotor like this, now this is cross-drilled and slotted, but what I mean by vented is I mean venting down the middle. So there's actually two areas that the rotor is having the pad contact, and then we have this hollow area in the middle. If it has straight slots like this one does, so we can see straight down to the bottom of the cart we have it on, then these rotors should be able to go in any direction. But some manufacturers will have these curved, and there will be a specific direction that these rotors go. Now this outside venting and slotting does have a direction that the manufacturer wants, and they've put a sticker on it for us. So this will indicate what side it needs to go on. So we're on the right front, so we're on the passenger side front, so we should be good there. Other than that, we just need to remove the old components and then we can move forward. So one of the other things is a lot of times the rotors can get stuck like this on the vehicle, and instead of, you can go through and try to hit the back of it with a hammer, but another method is a lot of manufacturers will drill 2 holes, and these are usually cut with 8x125 thread pitch bolts, or sorry, threads for a bolt, and you can put a bolt in, and then from there you can tighten this down. So what we're going to do is we're just going to thread this in, and this will push the rotor against the hub face and come over that rust lip just like that. Now if they're really bad, you can dance back and forth between the 2 that you have, but that's a little bit more civilized way of getting the rotor to pop off without having to use a hammer and flambaste it to death. All right, so at this point what we need to do is we need to try to get rid of this rust that can build up on this hub face. So we're going to go around with a wire brush and scrape off all of the rust so that our new rotor has a nice even face to mate against. All right, so the next thing we want to do is we do want to, anytime these rotors come from the manufacturer, they do have a bit of machining oil on them. And this is so that they don't rust during transit. So we're just going to hit it real quick with some brake clean and do our best to not touch the surface of it. And then from here, what I like to do to prevent the rotor from sliding back like that, I'll take one of the lug nuts and thread it on by hand. That way the rotor won't slide back and we can get the caliper and the caliper hanger on. Another thing that you need to do too is, you know, now that we know that this is in the right position, we do want to take this sticker off and peel that off so that it doesn't interfere with the mounting of our wheel. All right, so what we're gonna do now is we're gonna load up the caliper bracket, and there's a couple things that we need to replace. We need to place the pad sliders. We also need to go through and grease up the piston pins, or sorry, the caliper sliding pins. So we'll just use a little bit of high temp brake grease on the caliper sliding pins, and then reinstall them. Inspect the boots too that these sit in. Sometimes they can get worn out and require replacing. The kit that this brake pads and rotors came with did come with new ones, but if they're not ripped, don't go to the struggle of replacing them, because they can be kind of a pain in the butt and getting on and off. So with those in place, we're going to remove our caliper pad sliders. Now we don't have to put any grease. With the use of these have the ability to be able to allow the pad to slide. They have a coating on them that allows the pad to move and slide in and out really easily. They can be kind of difficult to get on and into place, and they may need some fettling to get to where they're fully installed. So from this point, we have our caliper pad sliders in place, and the pads will have an orientation. So there's a little spring pad that this needs to ride on, and this needs to ride on this silver section. And a lot of times what we'll also have is we can tell that this pad, which is our inner pad, is going to have the squeaker. Now this is a little device that when we wear through this pad material, this will contact the rotor, and that gives us our loud squeak noise. And typically these are going to be on the inside of the caliper hanger, so on this section. So what we'll do is we'll get this loaded into place. Again, this can take a bit of fettling, and then we can get it installed on the car. All right, so we got our pads loaded in. We have our little sliders, and the pads are in place. Sometimes it's easier to get the pads on the caliper hanger off the vehicle. Other times it's easier to do it with everything on the vehicle. The way that this manufacturer has the caliper sliders and the pads go and these spring clips is different than other manufacturers, and it can be different from make to make. So it kind of is one of those things that's going to be specific for each vehicle. So what we'll do now is we'll mount this caliper hanger onto the steering knuckle and torque it to spec, and then we'll move on to compressing the caliper pistons. All right, so our next step, we have our caliper bracket with the pads loaded in it. We have our rotor on. Next thing we're gonna do is we have to compress these pistons in the caliper. Now, this is a dual piston slider, so we're gonna use this adapter, which the silver portion is going to act against the pistons, and this black section is going to stay stuck to the fixed part of the caliper. That will compress these pistons down. A couple things to note with this: you can get away with doing this with a C-clamp and an old brake pad. Just make sure you're going in the middle of it when you're doing that. The other thing too is you can only do these with one caliper off at a time. If we were to have the driver's side caliper off and we were to compress these pistons, we would run the risk of the brake fluid coming up through the circuit and going out the driver's side caliper and popping the pistons out of the caliper itself. So we want to make sure that anytime we do this, we have one caliper at a time that we're doing this. So I'm going to mount this in place and then just squeeze the trigger until the caliper pistons go down. All right, so with the caliper pistons completely retracted, we can hit this release lever up on top of the tool, and that will allow us to remove the tool from the caliper. And then we can mount the the caliper with the collapsed pistons onto the brake hanger. The other thing to note with this too is make sure you're inspecting these dust covers, that they're not ripped and there's no dirt and debris stuck in them. All right, so at this point I've torqued down my caliper to the caliper hanger to the proper spec. There's a couple things we need to go over before we slam the wheel on and get this ready to go. And back on the road is we will do one more blast with brake clean to get off any junk that your greasy hands got on the rotors. This can be kind of difficult with the backing plate if your vehicle is equipped with that, but it is one of those things that you just try to do your best, and it will burn off with a little bit of time. The pistons are also completely collapsed on the front brake part of the brake circuit. So before we unrack the vehicle, what it's a good idea is to get into the car and pump the pedal slowly with your foot until you build up hydraulic prime and the pedal becomes very firm. That way the brake calipers are compressing the pistons against the rotor and you don't run the risk of crashing the car trying to back it out. The other thing that you need to do is the brakes will need to be bed in. They are going to smoke quite a bit, and it's going to be real stinky, but you do need to follow the manufacturer of the pads recommendations for braking on the pads against the rotors. More often than not, it's stopping 8 to 12 times from 30 miles per hour to 10 miles per hour, giving adequate time in between stops for the brakes to cool down, and that's usually a good practice in bedding the brakes. That will prevent the rotors from getting warped, and it will make the pads get along a whole lot better with the rotors. The only thing we need to do is just clean the inside hub of the wheel, mount this up and torque it to specifications, and then this job is done. This should be a very straightforward job. Other vehicles might have different variations if it's a fixed caliper or if it's a single piston slider. Just follow service procedure for that, but this is just kind of giving you a general overview of servicing front disc brakes. I appreciate you taking the time to watch the video, and I will see you in the next one.